It was a cold, eerie evening when Daniel, a 17-year-old high schooler, decided to take a shortcut home through an old, forgotten road. His phone had died, and his friends had left him behind at the party. He'd heard the stories about this road, but dismissed them as myths. It was just a dark, overgrown path. Or so he thought. As Daniel stepped onto the road, the hairs on his neck stood up. The wind had stopped, leaving an unsettling silence. A flicker of light appeared in the distance, maybe a car or something else. The road was narrow and winding, surrounded by thick trees whose branches stretched like twisted hands. Daniel's unease grew. His breath was visible in the frigid air, but his footsteps made no sound. A faint whisper drifted through the trees. Daniel froze. Someone called his name. Spinning around, he saw no one. The minutes stretched endlessly. The road bent and twisted, warping his sense of time and space. Was he passing the same tree again? The whisper returned, louder this time. "Daniel." The voice felt eerily familiar but distant. It wasn't his mother or friends. His heart pounded as fear crept in. He tried to stay calm, telling himself it was a prank or an animal mimicking a voice. But each step felt heavier. The branches closed in, hiding whatever lay ahead. Then he heard footsteps. At first, he thought they were his own, but they were slower, deliberate. He paused. Someone was following him. He spun around, but the road was empty. Darkness shrouded everything, and the silence grew suffocating. The voice came again, closer. "Daniel." This time, it was a presence, not just a sound. The road twisted deeper into unfamiliar woods, dragging him into an otherworldly place. Civilization felt far away. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the end of the road. Tall and unnaturally still, it loomed in the shadows. Its silhouette was vaguely human, but something was off. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. The figure's face stretched in a grotesque grin, pale, sickly, with empty sockets where eyes should be. Those hollow pits seemed to stare straight into his soul. The figure stepped forward. The footsteps were the same ones he'd heard behind him. Panic surged through Daniel. He ran, but the road never ended. It curved and looped back, mocking his every move. The trees closed in, branches reaching like skeletal hands. No matter how fast he ran, the figure was still there, getting closer. Gasping for air, he stumbled and turned to face the pursuer. The world stilled. Silence thickened around him. "Daniel, you shouldn't have come here." The voice was his own. The figure just inches away was a twisted version of himself. Daniel realized the horrifying truth. The figure hadn't been chasing him. It was him. A distorted reflection, born from the road's curse. The road wasn't a shortcut. It was a trap. A living thing feeding on the souls of the unwary, twisting them into something unrecognizable. Daniel felt the ground shift as the figure reached out. Darkness swallowed him. The last thing he saw was the figure's face. His own, hollow and broken. Days later, a search party looked for Daniel. They found no trace except a faint trail leading to the old road. The searchers felt an eerie wrongness and stopped, too afraid to go further. The road became a whispered legend, forgotten by most. But some nights, if you stand by the road, you might hear footsteps, slow, deliberate, just behind you. And if you turn around, it might be too late. The road never forgets. It always claims its own. If you like this terrifying true horror story, subscribe to Brith Blood Horror for more spine-chilling tales. Stay safe and remember, some roads are best left forgotten. Daniel's disappearance left a void in the community. His friends whispered in hushed tones. Guilt etched in their faces. They shouldn't have left him behind that night, they'd say. Teachers at school mentioned him less and less as the days turned into weeks, and the posters with his face slowly disappeared from lampposts and bulletin boards. Those closest to him, the silence was unbearable. Daniel's younger sister, Emily, refused to believe the stories. She was just 15, but had the fierce determination of someone far older. She couldn't accept that her brother had simply vanished into thin air, swallowed by a road that didn't exist on any map. Night after night, she scoured the internet, reading every fragment of folklore and legend tied to the old road. Most were vague, riddled with inconsistencies. Stories of people who'd entered but never returned, of voices calling out in the dark, and shadows that moved with minds of their own. One account stood out, an old diary entry dated nearly a century ago. The road is not of this world. It is a mirror, a reflection of fears and regrets. Once you step on it, it knows you. It becomes you. Emily's heart raced as she read those words. She couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel was still out there, trapped in some twisted dimension. She decided to go to the road herself, armed with nothing but a flashlight and a backpack. She waited until her parents were asleep and slipped out into the cold night. The road was exactly as Daniel had experienced it, cold, silent, almost sentient. Emily's footsteps echoed, each one growing quieter as though the road absorbed the sound. She called out her brother's name, her voice trembling in the darkness. The trees loomed larger than she remembered, their branches arching like skeletal arms. Her flashlight flickered. "Daniel," she whispered. The word felt swallowed by the night. A whisper answered, faint and distant. "Emily?" She froze. The voice was familiar, too familiar. She turned, shining the flashlight into the darkness, but nothing was there. The road twisted and looped, and she felt her sense of direction slipping away. Had she passed that same gnarled tree before? Her breathing quickened. "It knows you." The diary's words echoed in her mind. She realized too late that the road was alive, feeding on her fear. She tried to retrace her steps, but the path seemed to change behind her. The trees closed in, branches intertwining like prison bars. The flashlight died, leaving her in total darkness. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. She didn't want to turn around, but something compelled her to. A figure stood at the edge of the path, tall, unnaturally still. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped into the dim light of the moon. It was Daniel, or something that looked like him. His face was pale, almost translucent, with deep hollows where his eyes should have been. His mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. "Emily?" His voice was a whisper and a scream all at once. She stumbled backward, the ground shifting beneath her. The figure's hand reached out, long and bony, the fingers ending in sharp points. She ran, the path twisting and warping around her. No matter how fast she ran, the figure was always just behind her, its footsteps in sync with her own. The whispers grew louder, voices layered upon each other, a cacophony of sorrow and despair. Faces emerged from the trees, hollow-eyed and broken, their mouths open in silent screams. Each face was familiar. People from the missing person posters, the ones who had never come back. Emily fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. The ground felt soft, almost liquid, and she realized she was sinking. The figure, Daniel, or what was left of him, loomed over her, its hollow eyes staring into her soul. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice a distorted echo of her brother's. The ground swallowed her. The search for Emily lasted longer than it had for Daniel. A community,
already scarred, plunged deeper into grief. Some said the family was cursed. Others believed the road had taken its due and would lie dormant again. But those who knew the legends understood the truth. The road was never sated. It was patient, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next soul to wander too close.
Years later, teenagers whispered about the road at parties, daring each other to venture down it. Most didn't believe the stories. They thought they were just ghost tales meant to scare kids. But every now and then, someone would go missing, and the whispers would start again. One night, a boy named Alex decided to test the legend. He'd grown up hearing the stories but dismissed them as nonsense. With a group of friends, he stood at the edge of the road, laughing and making jokes. "Watch me," he said, stepping onto the path. The laughter faded as he disappeared into the shadows. Minutes passed. His friends called out, "There,